I have spent 31 years keeping people alive with my hands. Cardiac surgery doesn't forgive hesitation. You learn that in your first year, or you wash out. Through 3 hospital mergers, a malpractice suit that took 2 years to resolve, and a bypass that went sideways at 2 in the morning, with no backup attending on call, and a 19-year-old resident going white at the table, I stayed level. My residents call it ice water in the veins. I used to take that as a compliment. None of that steadiness helped me when I slipped my hand into my wife's coat pocket, looking for a parking stub, and pulled out a hotel key card I didn't recognize. The coat was the camel-colored wool one she'd bought last October. She'd asked me to grab the stub because she was running late for something. The key card read Ritz-Carlton Millennium, room 1204. The checkout date stamped on the back was 4 days earlier. She had told me she was at a 2-day departmental retreat in Indianapolis. She had texted me a photo of a hotel room. It was not that hotel room. It was not that My name is James Calloway. I'm 54 years old. I'm a cardiovascular surgeon at Mercy General in Chicago, and until the evening of February 12th, I believed the hardest thing I would ever do was stand in a waiting room and tell a family that surgery hadn't gone the way we'd hoped. I was wrong about a lot of things that winter. My wife and I had been married 24 years. She ran the Office of Academic Affairs at Northfield University, a position that suited her precisely because she was brilliant at managing how things looked from the outside. We met when we were both 30, she finishing her dissertation, and I finishing residency, both of us exhausted and determined, and we chose each other with the same certainty we brought to everything else. We built a life. Our son was born 2 years in, grew up watching me leave before dawn, and last spring moved to Minneapolis to argue with city planners about stormwater infrastructure, which seemed like a reasonable thing for a person with his values to do. The house in Lincoln Park, the cottage in Door County. 24 years. I stood in the front hallway, looking at that key card for a long time. Then I set it back exactly where I'd found it. I am not a dramatic person. I don't slam doors or raise my voice. What I am is methodical. I checked her email on the shared tablet we kept on the kitchen counter. She'd logged in that morning and forgotten to sign out. The only reason I had access. It took me 5 minutes to understand what I was reading, and another 10 to understand how long it had been happening. His name was Stephen Kincaid. He was an architect, 49, well-regarded in the city's development circles. He had led the design team on Mercy General's new East Wing 2 years ago, which is how he and my wife had met. They'd been thrown together on a university hospital partnership committee. Months of meetings I had been too busy to attend. He and his wife had come to dinner at our house twice. I remembered thinking he was charming in the specific way of men, who are very conscious of being charming, and that his wife Diana was the more interesting of the two, and that she seemed to know it. The emails went back 16 months. I read enough to know what they were, and then I stopped, because I had the essential fact and everything else was detail. She was in love with him. Or believed she was. They had been careful. A separate email account I hadn't known about, a number on her recent calls I didn't recognize. He was a man accustomed to managing complicated projects, and he had applied that same precision here. I heard her car in the driveway. I closed the tablet, walked to the kitchen, and started the coffee maker. When she came through the door, I was standing at the counter, the way I stood there any other evening. She kissed my cheek and told me about a budget meeting that had run long. She asked if I'd thought about dinner. I said there was pasta from Tuesday. She said, "Perfect," and went upstairs to change, and I stood there listening to her footsteps on the ceiling and understood that I had just watched a very skilled performance, because I had been giving one myself. I did not sleep that night. By 5 in the morning, I had made 2 decisions. First, I would not confront them on instinct and give them time to construct a shared story. Second, his wife deserved to know. Diana Kincaid was not difficult to find. Her nonprofit, media literacy programming in public schools, had a clean, professional website with her direct contact information. I called from my office the next day during a gap between procedures. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was composed and neutral in the way of someone accustomed to receiving information she would have preferred not to receive. I told her who I was. Said it was urgent. Said it concerned her husband and my wife. Said I preferred to say the rest in person. There was a pause, not shocked, more like a recalibration, and she gave me a coffee shop near her office on Michigan Avenue. She was already there when I arrived. Gray blazer. No jewelry except small gold studs. Coffee in front of her. She looked at me the way a journalist looks at a source, measuring what was true, what was useful, what needed independent verification. I told her everything I knew. I kept it factual and linear. When I finished, she sat with it quietly, and then she asked how long it had taken me to call her. I said 18 hours. She nodded once. I've been suspicious for about 4 months, she said. I didn't have proof. I was still deciding what to do with what I did have. She wrapped both hands around her mug. Stephen is on the architecture committee for the Medical Foundation Gala. Friday night. Mercy General's annual fundraiser. You'd normally attend. I would. My wife would too. We had gone together every year for the past 8. They'll both be there, Diana said. Separately, as they always are in public. She had been an investigative journalist for 12 years before she left to run the nonprofit. Over the next hour, she told me that, and also what she'd been quietly documenting since her suspicions started. Gaps in Stephen's calendar that didn't match his stated schedule. Charges that turned up on a credit card he thought she didn't monitor. A pattern of availability that had shifted exactly 16 months ago. She was methodical. She had filed everything away without knowing what it meant. Now she knew. I'm not interested in a public scene for its own sake, she said carefully, and I believed her. But certain people need to know certain things. Stephen's firm is on the short list for the surgical center contract. 3 members of Northfield's foundation board sit on the hospital's community advisory panel. If relevant information about professional relationships and conflicts of interest happens to surface in the right room. She let that sit. The right room on Friday night would contain the hospital's board of trustees, the senior administrative leadership, and the largest donors in the city's medical philanthropic community. I'll be there, I said. I'll get us seats at the same table as the oversight committee, she said. She reached into her bag and set a small flash drive between our coffee cups. Stephen keeps everything organized on his laptop. Personal and professional, same machine. He's very thorough. I looked at the drive, then at her. You've had this a while. 6 weeks, she said. I was deciding. She met my eyes steadily. Now I've decided. That evening I called my son. He'd left me a message I hadn't returned, which wasn't like me, and he noticed immediately that something was off in my voice. I told him I had a difficult week at the hospital. He said he understood, then said something that stopped me cold. He'd been talking to his mother, and she'd mentioned we were going through a rough patch. He hesitated. Then he told me she'd said she thought I might have developed feelings for a colleague, that she was worried I'd grown distant. I sat down at my desk in the dark. She told you that, I said. Dad, I didn't really. I didn't believe it. I figured she was stressed. She's stressed, I said. Get some sleep. I'll call you this weekend. After we hung up, I called Diana and told her what my son had said. She listened all the way through before speaking. Stephen told his sister something similar about me 8 months ago, she said. That I was emotionally withdrawn, that he was worried about our future. His sister came to me privately, thought she was doing me a kindness. A short pause. They're not just having an affair, James. They've been building a narrative. They need a version of events where they aren't the people who destroyed 2 marriages. They're writing that version now, while we still don't know what's coming. I had spent 31 years understanding structural failures. What happens when something is compromised at the foundation before anyone notices at the surface? I understood now, sitting in the dark in my own study, that my marriage had not been falling apart. It had been quietly, deliberately dismantled. Friday, I said. Friday, she agreed. The Ritz-Carlton ballroom was full when Diana and I arrived. She wore a simple black dress and moved through the room like someone who had given press briefings and wasn't afraid of a crowd. I wore the charcoal suit my wife had always said looked serious, which felt appropriate. We collected drinks, and positioned ourselves along the perimeter, and I scanned the room the way I scan imaging, filtering for what matters. I found my wife first, near the stage, talking to someone from the university development office. She wore a deep burgundy dress I'd never seen before, and she looked at ease in a way I recognized. The ease of someone who believes they are exactly where they're supposed to be. I found Stephen at the bar with two men from the hospital's construction oversight committee, laughing with the body language of a man who considers himself securely on the right side of every room he enters. Diana and I positioned ourselves and waited. 20 minutes. The event photographer moved through the crowd, a young woman I'd spoken with during cocktail hour, and I made sure I knew where she was. I watched the exact moment they registered each other, from across the room, the nearly imperceptible adjustment, the particular way two people who know each other very well perform not knowing each other in public. They drifted, separately, toward the same corner near the back terrace doors. We followed. Stephen had his hand resting lightly on my wife's arm, the kind of contact that looks like nothing, like someone steadying a passing acquaintance. When she saw me, the color left her face in a way I will not forget. Her eyes moved from me to Diana and back again, and in that single second, I watched her understand that this was not an accident, not something that could be redirected with a reasonable explanation, not a situation she could manage her way out of. 24 years of knowing her face, and I could read every beat of that realization. James. Her voice was almost steady. I thought you had the cardiology symposium this weekend. I came back early, I said. Diana stepped up beside me and looked at her husband with an expression I can only describe as the opposite of theatrical. It was very quiet and very final. Stephen. She took a folded document from her handbag and set it on the cocktail table beside them. Your calendar. 14 months. Hotel reservations, restaurant charges, a parking garage on Randolph Street you've visited 43 times. I've shared copies with my attorney and with the hospital's ethics officer, given the active contract discussions. She spoke at a volume calibrated for the four of us, and for the two couples standing close enough to have heard every word. Stephen started to say something measured. His instincts were good. He knew how to lower temperature in a room. But this wasn't a room he could lower. My wife reached for my arm and said, quietly and urgently, that we didn't have to do this here, that we could go somewhere private, that we could work through it. You've been working through things privately for 16 months, I said. You've been telling our son I have feelings for a colleague. You've been telling your friends our marriage was already ending before any of this started. You wrote a story where I'm the problem, and you've been circulating it for months. I kept my voice level. This is the part you didn't get to write. She looked at me, and for a moment the performance dropped completely. Not the practiced devastation of someone managing a scene, but something real and old and irreversible. 24 years is 24 years. I am not made of stone. I felt all of it. But I remembered what she'd told my son. My attorney will be in touch, I said. Don't come home tonight. The hospital's chief operating officer materialized at my shoulder within minutes, his expression telling me he'd heard enough. Stephen's second contract, the surgical center, went under immediate review. The photography from that evening, the candids I'd made sure were taken, circulated quietly among the people who needed to see them. Word moved through that particular network the way it always does, faster than anyone expects. I didn't stay for the rest of the gala. I checked into a hotel on Wacker, turned off most of my notifications, and sat on the edge of the bed while the adrenaline finished burning through me. There was a message from my son. He'd heard something from someone who knew someone who had been there, and his message said, simply, call me when you can. I'm not going anywhere. I called him. That was the genuinely hard part, not the hotel ballroom. Not standing in front of the people my wife had worked alongside for 15 years and saying what needed to be said. Telling your son that the foundation he'd been standing on wasn't what he thought it was. That requires something the operating room never asked of me. He was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then he asked if what his mother had told him about me and a colleague was true. I said no. He said he knew. He'd known before I said it, but he needed to hear it. He asked what I needed. I said, I needed to figure out where I was sleeping this week, and he laughed, one surprised involuntary sound, and said he was coming down on the weekend and that he didn't want to hear that I was fine. 3 days after the gala, my wife asked to meet me, not through attorneys, through a text, asking for an hour at a public place. I thought about refusing for most of a morning. Then I said yes, because I needed to understand, and because I've spent a career believing that failing to understand something is a failure of attention rather than an act of mercy. We met at a cafe in Wicker Park. She was there when I arrived, both hands around a mug, looking like she hadn't slept in days. She didn't start with excuses. That was the one thing that surprised me. She said she wasn't going to tell me it was my fault. She said she knew how that would sound, and she wasn't going to do it. She said she had been lonely in a specific way she hadn't known how to name. Not the absence of love exactly, but the absence of being known. That I had been present in our life the way a load-bearing wall is present, essential, reliable, structural, and ultimately experienced as something you work around rather than something you live with. That she had spent years feeling like she was the supporting detail in the story I was actually living, which was surgery, which was the hospital, which was a calling she respected and had never shared. She said she knew this wasn't an excuse. She had told herself the same thing. I asked about the other part. The narrative. What she'd told our son, what she'd told her friends, the careful, quiet work of making me into someone who had already been absent for so long. That whatever she did next would look like self-preservation. She looked at the table for a long moment. I was afraid, she said. If I was going to leave, if I was going to blow up 24 years, I needed a version of it I could survive. I needed to believe, and I needed other people to believe, that I wasn't the person who caused this, that I was the person responding to something. She looked up. I know what that cost you. I know what I put Evan through with that story about you. I'm not asking you to understand it or excuse it. I'm telling you it was fear, not cruelty. I know that distinction may not matter to you. It matters, I said. It doesn't fix it, but it matters. We sat quietly with that for a while. I did not forgive her that morning. I don't know yet if that comes later or doesn't come at all, and I've stopped treating it as a problem I need to solve on a particular timeline. What I did was understand her better, which is a different thing, and which I hadn't expected to find valuable. She moved to Portland in April. Her sister is there. She and our son have been talking, carefully, imperfectly, the way people do when there's real damage and real love occupying the same space. He went to visit her in June and texted me afterward that it had gone okay, which I understood to mean it had gone as well as it could have. Stephen's firm lost a surgical center contract. He and Diana are divorcing. She told me when we ran into each other at a hospital benefit in March. Invited in her own right for the nonprofit school programs. She looked different. Less armored was the phrase that came to mind. She said she had started writing again, long-form pieces for a magazine she'd worked for in her 30s, the kind of work she'd set aside when she decided Stephen's career needed more of her time. I found an apartment in the West Loop in February. 8th floor, south-facing windows, enough light in the mornings to make the place feel larger than it is. My son helped me carry boxes, and then stood in the middle of the empty living room and said, with what I recognized as deliberate lightness, that it was actually kind of nice. I said I thought so too. I still operate 4 days a week. My hands are still steady. My residents still talk about ice water, and I still take it as a compliment. But I understand now that it's only useful when you know which situations require it, and that there are moments when what's needed isn't steadiness, but the willingness to let the weight of something be exactly as heavy as it is, and to sit with it until it becomes something you can carry. Diana and I have had coffee 4 times since February. Twice we talked mostly about our kids. Once we walked along the Chicago River for an hour and said almost nothing, and it was the most comfortable I'd felt in months. I'm not putting a name to it yet. She isn't either. But last week, walking back toward Michigan Avenue in the early evening, she said she hadn't expected this. I asked what she meant. She said she hadn't expected that something that started in this much damage could feel this far down the road, like the beginning of something. I'm a man who works with evidence. What I can see, what I can measure, what I can repair. What I know is that I am 54 years old, and I found, in the rubble of 24 years, something I hadn't gone looking for. Someone who came through the same storm and came out of it still standing, still paying attention, still curious about what comes next. That's not nothing. In fact, I'm starting to think that might be everything. I never did find the parking stub.